2, 1. Panels, we think it takes a village. We think that the welfare and emotional welfare of the children are the most important thing here, better than anything else. We have other benefits that we can talk about in this debate. We're all happy to flag them in our speeches, but we think this is the main metric to judge this debate, and we'll analyze mostly on that. Firstly, while you guarantee emotional security to the child. Secondly, why you increase their independence and their opportunities for self-actualizations more than emotional security, emotional growth. Let's talk about firstly about our stance, how we think this world is likely to look like. The world that we would prefer is sort of like a small town atmosphere where everybody is sort of the child of everybody else. You always have an available adult figure that you will think about as a parent. You're encouraging your children to recognize any available adult as someone that is equivalent to your biological parent. We think that it's very likely that your biological parents are the most accessible to you. They'll still we think it's likely they'll still grow up those children in the ages of like 0 to 3. But after that, we will encourage the children to run around and meet other adults. We'll normalize other adults being more of a parent figure, parent thing to them, not referring them back to other like their biological parents. And we think there are several models where this can happen. They're all fine. Like a children home, you're not necessarily sleeping in the same place as your biological parents. We think whenever you decide that within your sort of community, within your commune, that's fine. Within the cities, we think that it's likely that these will grow more of like of a governmental care infrastructure, like kindergartens, where you actually think about your teachers as your actual parents, or primary schools, that sort of thing. It's likely that you'll have these because these societies have formed around these ideas that caring for these children collectively is for the better good, is how you create better adults, better, more functioning people. They're more likely to contribute towards that and be more prone to advocate for that. Let's get to my point. Why we guarantee emotional security. Simply put, for the first point on that, you have more parents to take care of you, right? We think that still in our world, people are still busy, still need to be productive, still need to work, and like we don't think we negate capitalism here. We think still people are likely to be swamped and need to be competitive with other people, but still, and also still a lot of people won't be experts at raising children, will be always emotionally attuned to care for their troubles. If your child had a fight with another child at school about something really stupid and trivial, we don't think you'll necessarily be able to empathize and sympathize with them. We think still that as a parent, you're still likely to cause them resentment towards you and things like that, and be more closed off if you're not always available. But in our world, it's simply normalized to address somebody else who is there, who might be more emotionally available to you. It's normalized for you as an adult to take care of someone else's biological child. We think that that guarantees for these children that there will always be somebody there to listen to them, to take care of their emotional needs when they're sad, when they're lonely, when they're not sure how they're feeling about the world. There will always be someone there for them that can help them, and they will never feel alone. We think that that's huge for emotional security. Yeah, let's take opening.
Will there be people who will take the disproportional burden of raising children in this system?
We think that might happen, but it's extremely likely that these are the people who are most happy to do that, the people who are most attuned to like people needs as opposed to things, people who are less interested in systematizing, more interested in caring for these people. I think that the most likely way that these communes will grow is for some people to take more of that burden, and specifically people who are more happy to do that, and the people who are not happy to do that were otherwise assume the other responsibilities that are important for that community to grow and thrive. We think this is a better model than people having to do them both all the time and not necessarily being good at either. Why we think that still you have the sufficient intimacy with a person who is not your biological parents. It's likely that that's someone you found at an earlier age and formed a connection with. It's likely that's someone you go to over and over again. It's likely somebody you think of as chosen family and therefore have a great degree on trust in them. Therefore, we think these people are very effective in helping you with your emotional security. And also, third point on this, you don't have a dependence on like the worst cases. an ineffective parent, a parent who's non-functioning, a parent who's simply cold or distant or have some sort of disability, or maybe even like a bad personality or bad actor as a parent, that these people can create huge damages to children and the status quo. That is something that we completely avoid here because you negate a lot of that damages. Now, do I have any POI, by the way, from closing? Opening, I can take you again. Closing? Yeah, closing. Go ahead.
What do you think happens to parents who believe that like stricter parenting forms, for example, are the way to take care of children?
We think that it might create some sort of like a marketplace of ideas on how to raise your child, and the children that go up the happiest if they encounter some sort of parenting technique will replicate that towards future generations. We think that's possibly the best model of parenting that you can have, like that the good ideas win out, regardless if they're like necessarily strict or very loose. Allegedly, the equivalent damage here is bad actors having more access to children, like less stranger danger leads to bad results. We think that it's extremely likely that in a closer community that is more isolated, there's a barrier of entry of trust that everybody needs to give to everybody. We think these are communities that are likely to be way more vetting of people who join them, and that's the a way more regularized way to build that. That's dependent on trust and other actors, other adults in your community being trustworthy and people you're likely to meet. You don't get any more, hey, don't approach that person, they're sort of a pervert, stay away from them. The communities are much more likely to throw these people out actively because they are much more afraid for their children in that way. We think that's a much better model of a community. We think that's way preferable for children, for their well-being, and for ability to self-actualize. And for all these reasons, we are very happy to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the leader of opposition.
Okay. Can you please confirm that I'm clearly audible?
Yep, you're good.
Thank you. Let me set up my timer. Okay. In that case, I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. What this debate lacks is contextualization. That's what I'm going to give to you. All of rebuttal will be integrated. OG's model is horrible. First of all, let's compare this to the status quo. We see that the majority of the benefit that opening government stand for can be accrued even without the implementation of this motion. Note that children have a lot of communal interaction with status quo in various ways. You have other family members other than your parents, your grandma and your grandpa, but also your extended family and relatives who you meet at family gatherings you can stay in touch with over social media. Secondly, children attend things like kindergarten or school where they interact not just with other children, but with their teachers and their professors, which means that they interact not just with different types of worldviews, but also different types of pedagogy and emotional support. Everyone has that one teacher they loved and could always go and talk to about something. Thirdly, if you train a sport, you go to training, coaches teach you different kinds of discipline, you interact with other kids, you build team spirit. But fourthly, your parents and your family are always part of a larger community. So you have neighbors you interact with very frequently. They visit your home and you visit theirs. Your parents may be a member of a religious community, so you attend service and mass, and you get to know other people within your community there. You play with other children on the street. So insofar as government wants to run any benefits of communal influence, be it interaction with other worldviews or emotional support, you're incredibly likely to have that on both sides of the house. So even in the worst case scenario for us, which is your parents are inaccessible because they work too much or they're even mentally abusive, it's a very high likelihood that one of the people within the communal systems around you is going to be a support structure for you and is going to be a parental figure for you, which means that a lot of their benefits are uncomparative. What is comparative is the harms of how these communities are probably going to look like. So let's lead you through the issues with this model. First of all, in order for these communities to work and for harmony to exist, for people to not antagonize each other in terms of who is treating which children better or worse, you need to establish strict rules of equal treatment towards all children. In terms of how much time you devote to them, you need to organize life in a way that it's clearly known when children interact with who and at what time. What does this mean? This means that you get less individualized child rearing, insofar as you have to devote a relatively equal amount of time to all children. This is problematic because children have different different emotional needs. Some children are more independent, some are more emotionally tied to their caregivers. Secondly, some children are more likely to socialize, some are less, which means that some need more time to be encouraged to socialize and to actually go out and play with other children and engage in communal activities. Thirdly, some children are more introverted. They have a harder time following schoolwork, which means they need more parental attention, they need help with their homework. Fourthly, they simply have different interests. This means that necessarily in order to functionally raise a child, you need to devote different time and different types of rearing to these children. This is why when you have a brother or a sister, you two are probably not raised in the same way, and your parents adapt to your individual needs. What happens on their side of the house is that children end up feeling neglected and their emotional development is harmed, insofar as they find themselves in a situation where their needs are not necessarily catered to because the community needs to implement strict rules as to how you're going to treat the children. What happens in the counterfactual, even if this doesn't happen, you're going to have a feeling of unequal treatment, because when all children are part of one community and the child sees another child getting more time from their caregivers, getting more attention from the community, getting more help and more interaction, they do not know the internal world of that child. They cannot rationalize when they're 8 or 9 years old, this child needs that. What they see is the external image of them receiving less time, which breeds antagonism both towards the caregivers, but also towards other children, which means that in both possibilities and both counterfactuals, the development of the children is harmed. But secondly, note that in terms of there being more care for children because there are more available caregivers, this is not proven from open government. What's likely to happen is a collective action problem. Insofar as in this situation, there are 10 or 15 or 20 caregivers, which means it's a lot easier to delegate. You do not have direct responsibility, which means you cannot tie the consequences to the life of the child and the development of the child directly to your actions, especially because the child is not your own, which means that insofar as that is true, it's probably likely that you get less time devoted to the children. But even if that were not true and parents were motivated to care about them, you simply do not know them, i.e. you know them less, because you have to interact with multiple children and time is a zero-sum game, which means that the counterfactual is when you have your own child and you individualize the rearing process. This means you get to know your child over time. You can read their reactions. You can see changes in their patterns of behavior and see when they're not feeling well. You can read visual, non-verbal cues, which may point to the fact that the child maybe has a mental illness or is struggling in school. When you have to devote your time to multiple children and collect multiple pieces of information, not only is time a zero-sum game, but you're less likely to be able to keep track of all of this, which means that insofar as opening government's benefit is better care for the children, our case and our characterization is logically prior to that, and they don't prove it. But also when they answer to our POI and they say the people who are going to take the most brunt of raising these children are going to be the ones who want to do it the most. No, it's going to be the ones traditionally expected to do it, namely women. Before I explain why that's horrible in terms of gender equality, I'm willing to take closing. Opening.
So sorry. So group institutions are really good at determining rules. You don't give any reason why these rules will be egalitarian. For example, schools are really good at giving resources to disabled children.
I preempted this. I literally gave you explanation of what happens if the rules are equal and even if they are unequal. Because if everyone is if everyone is perceived to be your parent, this is like when you are the neglected sibling and you feel horrible because you feel your parents are giving more time to your little brother and you cannot understand why that happens. You just see they're spending less time with you. It makes you feel horrible. In terms of the argument of women, first of all, note that in this community, there is a norm of not outsourcing child rearing, because you as a part of the community are expected to give your part in raising the child, which means there is a less of a culture of sending children to kindergarten or hiring someone outside of the community like a babysitter, explicitly considered by opening government. The consequence of this is that given that patriarchal norms which force women to be caretakers and take care of the children exist on both sides of the house, this means that women have less capacity to outsource this and escape this, which means that they're forced by the community to give up their individual decision to potentially start a career. But secondly, note that there is a more larger generalized norm that children are the wealth of the community, the gold of the community. That's why we all raise them together, which means there's a generally more of an expectation for you to have children in the first place, to put women through childbirth and child rearing, even though they may not want to do this because it's a communal pressure put on the women. Before moving on to my final point, I'll take open government.
Inside the school, other adults are actively discouraged from engaging with children and treated with suspicion if they support them emotionally. You don't get this kind of emotional guarantee that you have in our world.
But you don't get this emotional guarantee because of the way the parents themselves are going to feel. And there's a couple of things I want to say here. First of all, not that parents still have a connection to their biological child. They conceived that child, the mother gave birth to that child, they gave a name, so they want to be connected to this child, and they see the child as an extension of their legacy. First of all, this means insofar as they're separated from their child a large amount of the time, they simply feel like shit. But secondly, they're more likely to be obsessive and controlling because they are the ones who want to have the influence over how they raise their legacy, which means they're going to police who this child is hanging out with. They're going to encourage distrust towards other other caretakers because they're consistently going to be afraid that somebody else is having more influence on their child than they currently are, which means that there is antagonism and not trust within the group, whereas the counterfactual is you know that you're the primary caretaker for that child and you're likely to be more permissive towards the child, creating other social connections and therefore accessing emotional support. But lastly, we see that these parents are simply unlikely to functionally devote time to children who are not theirs, because they were always going to be imagining that they're actually spending the time with the child they want to spend time with, which means they're going to compensate by caring for these other children less, because they're going to feel like horrible shit because they cannot spend time with their own child and they feel the community is pressuring them. So this means that towards the entire community and towards the children, the parents themselves, who are the actors of the motion, are going to have a negative interaction, which means that open government did not prove their benefits in this debate.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hold up. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Do a big mistake in this debate by basically assuming that our world is going to be exactly the same as today, just people growing up in communes. This is a big miss of this debate that causes them to miss out that people feel much more secure when they are growing up. This is how the communities are going to form to begin with from the dawn of history. This creates a situation which just generates better individuals, which have better emotional stability. I'm going to have 3 points in my speech. First of all, talk more about the characterization. Secondly, why children feel more secure. Lastly, why we just get a better society. So here's the thing. For you to count on other people to raise your children, something that you biologically feel the need to do, you need to feel safe in this community. Otherwise, the community wouldn't form. When opening opposition tell us in the last few seconds of the speech that a lot of people are going to be jealous and feel like their children are getting closer to other parents. This is not how such a commune can actually work. And note, we're talking about centuries of evolution of these communities to grow to a specific situation where people don't feel this kind of envy. Moreover, they feel secure. They feel that they can hand out their children to other people and they can take care of the people from these societies, right? Because otherwise, nobody will live in such communes when they don't feel secure, when they feel all the bad feelings that opening opposition have. So it has to be something which is manageable, right? This creates cooperation between people because now you have like voting systems and stuff like that to discuss which kind of education system you want from the children, something that didn't get actual response from opening opposition. There is no such thing as not asking a child what's going on with them, right? Each and every parent now lives in a community where they feel this solidarity and they feel that they have the responsibility to take care of all the other children. So you can't just say, oh, wait a minute, someone else will take care of them. No, you feel the urge to do it yourself. This also leads to screening of bad people from these communities. What do opening opposition respond to this? They say, well, you know, under their world, you have grandmas and teachers. First of all, in a lot of situations, they live far away. They aren't with you in the afternoon or your entire day to day. They don't care about you as much because for teachers, it's like a job and stuff like that. We think that this doesn't answer in any way. When your neighbors, that's the less comparative, are people that come from home. They're really tired and really don't want to take care of other children. This is not the world that we're describing that actually grows differently. But even if they are right, note, that this isn't the comparative in the world today, right? They're defending status quo. They can't say that in the majority of cases, people get this solidarity. So we're going to win on this to begin with if they concede that this is something that is good, right? Let's talk about where do children feel more secure before that closing. Opening?
Opening.
Okay.
Opening.
Yeah.
So a connection exists to your child on both sides of the house because of the biological fact of birth and because of the legacy and the name that you attach to that child. So the mechanism for distrust in the community exists a priori to this community being the counterfactual.
No, Tina, nurture versus nature, right? It's something that is always discussed. It's something that always changes. We just described how these communities grow out beyond this nature and actually have this nurture urge to take care of all of the people. We think that this is a huge, massive change in this debate. Why do people feel more, why do children feel more secure? So we give you much more emotional support, right? When the societies just develop differently, you trust more other people. You're much more open with them. You're much more open with these adults and telling them all of your problems. This just means that you are not alone, that other people feel what you feel, that you count much more on other people, and you don't feel this loneliness and depression that a lot of people get to feel. What do we hear from opening opposition on this? We hear, you know, children have different types of needs. Some are introverts, some need different interactions, stuff like that. Exactly, that's why you need to diversify the risk of having only one parent and instead having 10 different parents which can take care of you, in which you can connect on different levels, right? If you don't like your own parent, you can go to another parent which is just more suitable to your way of upbringing, and they're going to approach you more and feel more connected to you as parents as well. We break off this dependence on a single parent, right? Compare that to parents who just don't take care of you, or parents who just feel like there's a right way to upbring their child. This is a horrible situation we just prevent. Opening opposition tells you can't understand the children in depth. This is what we explain to you, why people are just so much more open to social interactions, because they have so much more interactions themselves. This just creates the ability for parents to understand the children much, much more. You don't need a lot of time. You just need the trust for someone to actually tell you what their problems are. Then opening opposition tells there's going to be a collective action problem, right? This assumes that the world is like it is today. When each and every parent takes responsibility for the entire group, people are not going to live in a society that doesn't take care of their children because they believe that this is a value. Moreover, a value is to take care of all the children around. But secondly, when we're talking about economy of scales, the amount of parents that need to actually create the food for the entire 10 children for lunch is now one parent over 10. This means that you have much more efficiency in parents that can actually take care of these children. It's much easier to help an entire group in their schoolwork and stuff like that. It's just much less time consuming. So you can now split the work between parents. Before I go on closing.
So your arguments so far seem to center around a characterization in which these communes seem like villagers that raise their children communally through no other option that they can have. Can you please explain how this is going to operate in places like urban areas in which uprootedness and
this in the mechanism already, that this is something that's going to be determined by the state, because if these communes grow from grassroots movements, a lot of people will want this kind of message to happen in an urban area. So we have like a small neighborhood of all these people who are tied down together. This is not contradictory. Then opening opposition tell us, well, women are going to have a problem. First of all, when we're talking about economy of scale and stuff like that, you need 1 woman to do a work of 10 today. So on the comparative, it's just going to be better even if they are right. But moreover, women have less political capital inside the relationship today as well, when we're talking about who is going to raise the children as well. So they have basically no comparative compared to a situation where this commune can now decide how they want to raise the children. So women just have more choice because there are more situations where you have this kind of market of ideas and you choose who are the children you take care of. This just leads, at the end of the day, that the children are much more stable when they're growing up. They have much better social ties, and you have much less extreme cases. This is enough for us to win this debate.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. I'll start soon. Look, we gave you really like a fair amount of reasons on why this is going to be a terrible idea. And the response we got from opening government is, well, if it was this bad, we can't prop the motion, so it necessarily needs to be good. That's not how it works. We gave you structural reasons why it's going to be bad in almost all of the cases. And then they said, but you have to assume that circumstances must be different. That's not how you win a prefers motion type of debate. But I think more importantly, when we talk about the connection that exists on both sides of the house, this is the idea that your child will likely have your traits, looks, you will have likely given them, fed them, give them literally milk and all of this. This is a mechanism here that at least proves that there's a special connection in terms of nature. It's irregardless of how we end up on the debate between nature and nurture, because the nature part always makes it up for exclusivity. But what we also talked about is why the nurture part of this debate also means that there's going to be psychological pressure on the parents to act differently towards their kids versus other kids because of reasons of how they are feeling, they are losing control. This only gets exacerbated when you get to the extreme type of the cases already, right? Because parents who are, let's say, tiger or very obsessive about their kids are going to feel much worse here. So you're not actually getting it better because you have the influence of other parents, but it's making them worse because they're feeling that they're losing much more control over their kids than in the status quo. So they don't get to claim that benefit as well. But I mean, listen to what OG says when they want to trash our larger social structure support. They say, oh, requirement is only people who live close by. But there are people who couldn't do that on your side of the house too, who don't have ability to do communal raising, who are left out of social fabrics. Just think about it like on the forms of societal status or income, and how these groups are going to largely, come with different from people from the same income group or the same society level group on your side of the house as well. So all of the problems that you have, for example, with equality or with the idea of, there's a separation in society based on class and things like this, you're actually making them much worse by forcing people to raise kids in a similar level. So if the criteria is proximity, then people who live in suburbs who are proximate to each other are going to have their own communities who are very suburban-like. And people who live in inner cities who are going to struggle with money, who are going to be like single parents, are who are going to have their own community. And at the point where this is more communalized, you have less incentive for any state to help these people because they have their communities. We don't need a communal response of the state because it's not individualized anymore. It's not the problem of individuals, it's the problem of community right now. So they should change their community and not wait for the state to react. So on their side of the house, actually people who are most disprivileged are getting less disprivileged because there's more inter-society connection. But also something which is very important and that OG doesn't mention is that kids are not a big rational actors who are going to be like, oh, I have these 10 different influences, I'm going to take the best out of all of these. Kids are going to be confused because they are confused already. I mean, have you ever judged the schools debate? It gets pretty confusing pretty fast, which means that different authority figures who tell them different things, and there's no scaling. Because in the status quo, one is your parent and the other is grandparent. So there's, grandparents are going to let you do anything, and then parents are going to be like, oh, maybe you shouldn't eat sweets before lunch or whatever. But on their side of the house, everyone is equal and everyone gives you input. And what this means is that for kids are very confused because there's different ways of raising children. And when you get, just bumped 10 different ways at you at the same time, you don't know who to listen. And this is another mechanism for the parents to actually think about how they're going to interact in these sort of scenarios, because they're likely to hear and feel the children confusion when there's contradicting messages which are likely to happen under this scenario. But also when they talk about who will bear the brunt of these things, I quote them, there are people who really want to do more about people needs as opposed to things. I think this is literally Jordan Peterson and his idea on why there's less women in STEM because they don't care about things. And this is actually what happens on their side of the house. People who have historically borne the pressure of raising kids. This is their historical counterfactual. 500 years ago, people were raised communally. It was mainly women who were raising people kids communally while men were working. This is something which you encourage on their side of the house because having children is now seen as a communal decision, as not an individual decision of yours. There's no individualist choices. There's no outsourcing to kindergarten or schools or camps because this is something which is not according to the line of how we should raise kids. I want to give a chance to closing government to react to this.
Is the problem with women not being in the workplace an aggregate problem, dares to say, the group of women writ large, or is it about one individual woman not being in the workplace?
It is about forcing communities and stereotypes on women. You increase this when you make the expectation more communal as opposed to more individualistic. And that's basically what we run here in the case. But also recognize that more authoritarian figures will sway more. So here's a comparative basically. Emotional trauma is more harming than emotional support is helping. Meaning that if there is a bad parent, they will harm all of the kids who they interact with. And this cannot be outweighed by good parents interacting with these kids. Because if they're abusive, it's enough that you have one parent who is abusive and the other 9 parents who are going to be supportive are not going to be able to levy the trauma away from the kid. So if there's a problem in status quo with some parents being abusive, on our side of the house, because it's a relationship between state and an individual, and then the state comes and says, you cannot raise this kid because you are abusive. It's easier than when you have an abusive parent inside of community and the relationship is between a state and the community and the abusive parent that you have inside of this. I want to give a chance to OG to engage.
When you grow up in a commune and trusting other adults is normalized, that's likely to be the majority. Worst damage, there will be some solitary parents. That's fine because the benefits accrue for the majority of people.
Yes, but you didn't prove that people will be normalized. The preferred motions does not assume that you can assume people will just think of this as normal. We gave you structural reasons why outside of this motion, people think in a certain way psychologically and why there are structures in place. So when you put this motion in the context of that, this is when you get a lot of distrust. This is when you get unequal treatment and a lot of problems that come with this. You cannot just fiat that people will get accustomed to it and then structurally all of the other problems are removed because people are accustomed. People can get accustomed to bad things. There are still bad things. Okay, so there's a pressure to always be under parent supervision also on their side of the house, meaning that there is going to be very little time for kids to play on their own because it's always someone's responsibility. And now you have more time. You can just share the burden. And someone always, you want to have more time with the kids because you don't get enough time, as the counterfactual says, when you're basically all of the time with your kid, then you let them play with other kids, which means that kids cannot form interactions with their peers on a normal basis without parents supervising them. And this is like bad. You know that kids play differently when there's no one watching as opposed to when there's like a parent who's like chaperoning them and all sorts of these things. So you're removing an essential part of primary socialization from the kids as well. But lastly, it is horrible for kids whose parents do not conform to the community guidelines or stereotypes. Religious minorities, queer parents, they're not going to be able to find a community that is going to accept them in a way, and you're going to basically ostracize them. All of the other majority people are going to have community parenting, while you're going to have a very individualistic type of parenting. You're going to feel much more ostracized than the status quo. That's why we are proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the member of government.
Sorry, am I audible?
Yep, you're good.
Opening opposition says, well, kids are going to be confused. But obviously, when there are different value of input, parents don't have to make decisions. It is to make an informative decision based upon a different level of information they're able to collect from other parents. I think they overly estimate how this norm is going to play out when it interacts with other societal forces. They then say, abusive relationship happens. But notice here that none of these communities are going to be binding in which you're unable to quit people out. There's societal checks you have and balances you have on it. The abusive nature gets checked by society because supposedly parents don't care about their children on our side of the house. Supposedly, you still look at the worst instances of abuses. I would also argue that it's easier for you to detect abuses that exist in these communities when the communities are interacting. That's what the other parents are able to check upon whether or not kids are abused, because kids show signs when they're abused, and that's when community is able to check it. The comparative is that police can never achieve that type of instances. So you then say, well, there's going to be disproportionate labor, which is largely going to be the largest impact you get from opening opposition. What I think they ignore is a historical retrospective social movement will still be able to happen. That is, feminism and the second wave of feminism will still examine how these social structures operate and how the necessary labor is divided. So it's still likely going to be equal sharing of acts, etc., etc. Now, I want to talk about two things in extension. The first thing I want to talk about is what the community provides for the kid. Because the problem with opening government is that they only focus upon the emotional security of a child. Supposedly, opening opposition is also right in some extent to show that some level of emotional engagement exists on the comparative. And nuclear family is still going to be more important in emotional security given biological intimacy and the amount of time you spend with a nuclear family. What community parenting does that extends beyond parents being together, it is to provide resources together, so the economy of scale to provide public goods that individuals cannot afford, and that is largely misunderstood by the upper house debate. What are these resources? Firstly, they look like community-based daycare center, right? These are beneficial to almost every member of the community. They unlock for a large amount of the labor forces, a large amount of the population in order to engage the labor force. They also allow for economic liberty that exists. The comparative is that in the status quo, individual parenting cannot afford it. So they do not have community-based system, but in fact, for-profit institutions arises. These are relatively inaccessible and are high prices. Second, there's going to be more funding for your local schools in your community, because the comparative that exists on their side of the house is that people exit. The most able kids goes into science schools. People who are rich then goes into other types of schools. What happens on our side of the house is that there's now community forces that bond them together that says that it is bad for you to quit. It is better for you to bond together as a community. And oftentimes we underestimate how important these forces are at changing the individualistic behavior. Certainly, the general facility for children is likely going to go up, right? These looks like playground or student medical centers, or like ability for us to detect diseases that exist in child. Fourthly, is the community checks and programs that exist in order to check upon abuses. These largely don't exist in status quo because we see a libertarian stance upon parenting. Fifthly, is that there's going to be like specific facility for disabled children. What exists in the status quo is that there's less community support for it, because we see them as individual units. When there's a community, there's a collective consciousness that individual internalize, that individual feel is important. How are these resources going to get existing on our side of the house? The first thing that happens is a greater pool of economic forces, because opening government misunderstood how economy and scale is going to exist. It is not only about cooking lunches for kids, it is also about the collection and the building of new classrooms, because it is equally as expensive to build classroom for one child as it is to build classroom for 20 child that exist. Second, so when you pool more resources together, this gets cheaper when you're able to have a greater pool of individuals that access it. Second, there's a greater level of resilience that individuals are able to have when financial crises come, because a greater pool of resources in order to combat you against that resilience. Thirdly, there's a greater level of justification when you get political funding, because now you have a greater project of political voice when you collectively together as a community. That's when you get pushed for. That's when you can push for funding. Why is this important? Firstly, resources are oftentimes the prerequisite for any type of social mobility. That is when the educational resources are paramount and changing and deciding which college you're able to get into, whether or not you're able to actualize. Second, it improves the materialistic condition of children. For a vast majority of children that exist in the world, the number one priority for them isn't spiritual connection with the community. It is the ability to get materialistic changes. It is the ability to get fed up by a community. It is the ability to access clean waters, the ability to access playing grounds for you as a child that gets infinitely improved on our side of the house. Part of our status quo is a world of individual detachment. So existing in status quo, that Chinatown has one of the best students that exists in New York City. But Chinatown doesn't have a good public school because people all exit rather than collectivizing and creating their own community for economies of change. Second argument, reversely, the community building upon you're able to, how does community building that helps a kid? Because the status quo is, I think Tim was right in pointing out that there's some sort of community that still exists. But oftentimes there are endogenous forces that are destroying this very notion of community. How will community, these endogenous forces, look at having more nuclear family or short-term connection, you have interactions with labor. How will community parenting help community how insist community values the children? Firstly, you like the people, right? You interact more with the people. That's when you learn about how the community functions. Second, you investigate further into the community. You look at stories, you look at problems that exist in community. Certainly, you build up resources in community. You go to school here. You have all of your human connections here. You listen to stories of individuals who got bullied in your community. You listen to stories that you will never hear when you exist in elite, not elite, when you exist in nuclear families that you're unable to access. Before I move on, go.
Open government says these communities form on the basis of proximity. Given that socioeconomic strata are very often geographically clustered into richer and poorer neighborhoods, Lover literally preempts this. How does your case then stand in terms of community services?
Community does not only offer in like richer and poorer community. Community oftentimes are often then decided upon ethnic lines. That's why we have like Chinatown, Koreatown. That's why we have different immigrant community that exist. Oftentimes, yes, there's some economic line, but that economic gap is oftentimes huge that exists in the same communities that exist. Why is this good? Well, because children are easily nudged by the existence of value we impose into them. I think this is able to solve the community detachment issues that exist in status quo. Because community extends beyond wide suburban areas. It also involves people who work abroad and never come back. We are now allowing for people to have some sort of moral connection that exists in the community. They're more likely to devote time that exists back in the community. They're more likely to do work in their community. They're more likely to send remittances, help their own community, and look at the structural problems that exist in their community. This is an important moral consciousness that we're able to build. Second, you're more likely to understand kinds of issues that exist in your community. For example, the largest issue that plagues Asian community isn't the ceiling, but rather the large wealth inequality that exists. When community interaction exists more, that's when we're able to impose social consciousness upon the children and show them that this is an important issue that is deserving to be changed. We change voter behavior in the long run when kids are changed and are educated in such a fashion. Certainly, we help the least well off the existing community. This can never be achieved in comparative, right? Or it's very unlikely to be achieved on a comparative, in which there's a competitive mindset that exists that sees kids as pitching against each other that exists in the community. But when they exist as a community, that's when artificial moral boundaries of what is considered as justice going to be imposed, right? You say that this person, although they're disabled, is part of my community, is someone that I'm deserving to help, that involves more social connections, that involves more social acceptance and better social policies for the most disabled that exist communities. Communities are diverse. We're very happy to build people to it and build community to people.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the member of opposition.
Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, cool, thanks. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. As an Asian, I am so proud to finally be able to do a motion about why communitarianism is bad. Let's just start by saying we agree with a lot of the stuff that CG talks about with regards to the characterization of how exactly these communes are likely to function, which we would give them credit to over OG, because we don't think OG actually explains to us how exactly communities change when they have to come together to raise children collectively beyond just saying that now every adult is like your parent. But I think that this is actually something that's incredibly bad. One, and the crucial piece of analysis that we will give you that we don't think OO gives you, is that the ways in which communes come together to form better advantages for the rearing of children comes uniquely from atomizing comparative advantages of individuals, such that the provision and social status of each individual within that commune is fixed so that they're able to maximize the efficiency through which that commune can function to deliver the best possible results for their children. And this is crucial because it means that once you are within that commune and once you begin to want to raise your children collectively, there is no actual way in which you're able to escape that particular social structure or system, and we think that's uniquely problematic. Because when you embark over things like rearing your children, which are systematically important to human beings and communities in the form of legacy, you basically embark upon a joint journey in which you shackle your life and your futures together, which means that under collective raising, the best case scenario of the government is one in which your entire commune is basically a massive extended family, but with the obligations that are accrued to each individual that are similar to that of what exists within a nuclear family. Here are some reasons why this is systematically harmful for the growth of children. The first reason why is because in such a world, the children who are being raised formatively now are in a situation in which the people that they are around never actually change, but it is not a small enough unit for them to be able to negotiate differences with. This is distinct from what the OO tells you, because all that OO tells you is that individuals can no longer, or children can no longer get individualized attention. But what we are arguing is that within a family unit, it is more likely that children are able to negotiate with the number of individuals that exist within a smaller unit, because these people have more of an incentive and desire to be able to accommodate and more capacity to accommodate what each child might potentially want. The flip side, however, in a communitarian village is because the children that you're with are the same 10 children you've always grown up with, because you want to fit in as a child, and because your formative years are literally surrounded by the same parents and children that are around you, you will always feel the pressure to conform and never be able to step out of line, even if it means that these things often reduce your capacity to exploit your fullest potential at what you want to do. How does this manifest? Firstly, you probably don't want to do super well in school, because what is the value of doing that where it's not your parents that are going to be proud of you, but rather you identifying yourself as different from the children that are around you, and also having like 10 different parents who may well not be particularly happy that you're the one child that is doing very differently. You don't want to stick out. the pressures of conformity within a communitarian environment are incredibly high, such that all children are more likely to parrot things like the ideologies that have been taught to them by that community, particularly because each individual is given a very specific segment of that social status and hierarchy that they must conform to, and they're unlikely to be able to develop their own forms of thought or ever be able to voice the idea that they want to establish or explore things that are outside of that particular commune. Therefore, as a result, we suggest that these individuals and these children will never be capable of understanding or conceptualizing of a world outside of that commune, and to the extent to which they want to, it's going to be significantly harder for them to do so. Yes, OG.
Given the depression, loneliness, and other bad mental states that children suffer right now because they don't have other resources, we much prefer a world where they do have other role models, a guaranteed security of guardians and carers beyond what we have right now.
No, but you're not getting what I'm trying to say, because you presume that the world that you are in is one in which the same level of diversity exists when it comes to role models and other forms of guardians that they might have. That's not true within a communitarian environment in which people are doing the same thing day in and day out, because that is the role that they have to accomplish within that communitarian sector. And therefore, that means that their capacity to be able to look for external alternative points of role models don't exist. The diversity in terms of the adult figures that you look up to only exists at the point at which each family unit is atomistic, so that they can each develop their own unique personalities and their own unique forms of growth. So, for example, if you have a friend whose parents you think are really cool, you can probably look up to them. It's much harder for you to do the same if that is also your parent and that person doesn't have the flexibility to be able to move out of a conformist perception within that commune. But the next thing then that we want to talk about with regards to why the specific impact of why communitarianism is really bad is because we suggest that this creates disproportionate problems for the child when they grow older when it comes to the obligations that they have to pay back to their community. This flips the CG argument around, because CG presumes that the burden of that commune is going to be shared equally among the children in a way that is fair and just when it comes to remittances and being able to take care of themselves. The first thing that we suggest is that the communal environment in itself specifically is one that displaces government obligation in a way that is much harder to do if you're an atomistic family and when you have to care about each individual child. But secondly, we suggest that oftentimes it is gambling, right? Because you raise 20 children and you expect that 2 or 3 of them will be able to make it big so that they can pay that money back to that commune, which therefore suggests that those 2 or 3 children that may put in the extra effort to be able to become successful, they often have to face things like, for example, social stigma and negativity against them when they were younger because they were sticking out of the crowd. Like, for example, Adebayo, are now the ones who are disproportionately shackled with the same moral and social obligation to pay back in ways that the rest of the commune have not significantly or substantially contributed back in the exact same ways. We suggest that that is an unfair imperative that you're putting, an imposition that you're putting on the next generation, everything that's uniquely harmful. The third thing that we want to argue then is that this is problematic when it comes to just the ways in which communes are likely to function. And I think that the failure of the government bench to be able to represent this accurately is actually hugely problematic. OO argues that they've preempted this. We don't actually think they have. The problem here is when you create communes, the way that you do so when it comes, it means that the extended and increased amount of interaction that exists within these families and these kind of areas means that you're most likely to capitulate towards those who share the most similar forms of characteristics to you. That's why even among Chinese diasporas, for example, you often see dialect groups clustering together because that is what they are used to and the kind of cultures that are more likely to be able to generate the communes that are self-sustaining over a longer period of time. But it is immensely harmful because these different clusters also have different levels of structures in the social hierarchy in society as a whole, and have different amounts of social economic capacities that they already have within that society, which means that your communes are structurally unequal and often force children to remain within those places because they can't fight back. Those that do manage to become successful are shackled by those communities. We argue that's horrible. We're happy to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the government whip.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're good.
The problem with this debate is that there was a lack of imagination from all teams involved, in which OG only saw the economies of scale in micro actions, not with the formation of norms and community pooled resources that make up everyday life. And the problem with OO is that they imagine a world in which feminism never existed and could mediate these norms, and that nature was so overbearing, even though in their own example, it was a world in which the past, recent past, be that as it may, was one where communal parenting existed. And then CO runs like some weird AMRAND extension that I'm going to deal with just fresh off the bat. So let's deal with CO. There's two kind of pushes here. The first from Shermay is to say, well, communitarian is bad because it stagnates values and locks individuals into those. But I would posit already in the status quo, controlling cultures already have that. Conservative cultures do not let their children out of their sight, have their own schools, and have their own ability to garner that. I would posit in the comparative, where geographically proximate individuals you have to share with them, there is a moderating effect in this that makes you not have to be as conservative and have to democratically defend your values, as OG says, in the marketplace of ideas. But specifically for these marketplace of ideas that you hold close in parenting, those are the ones you are going to fix the most when you interact with children, when you see a bruise due to corporal punishment and it has to be questioned. That is the reason why OO also falls in this case, because it's just not true that in a lot of these cases that the state will be displaced, because things like child abuse need the police to step in, need an investigative power, and it's likely you are going to bar the one abusive parent from the communal parenting law by the 9 other parents because 9 outnumbers 1. I'll take O at this time.
In these communities, minorities still exist. If you're a minority, the type of raising in the community is not just inaccessible, but very often actively contrary to both your values and often your identity. This confuses children, but also ostracizes people. How does your case contend with that?
So one, you rebut that yourself when you say communities are oftentimes away from one another and structurally segregated away. But secondarily, minorities have always existed within their own culture. So it's likely Hasidic Jews are not going to have their children raised by non-Hasidic Jews on either side of the house. The question is, do you have all the Hasidic Jews coming together and in those conservative cultures and therefore have to moderate and justify to one another? Or do you raise it in one household where the bruises and abuse can be hidden away? So at the end of this, we tell you is moderating, and you are likely going to get ideological diversity in the times, in the comparative, because in their world is one family group. In our world, multiple family groups have to justify to one another. Yes, they are ideologically similar at times, but there's always more difference among multiple individual groups rather than one family unit, which literally chose one another to become a couple. So the second piece of analysis I want to deal with is the question of, does this asymmetrically fall upon individuals, which is the other OO and CO push? The problem here is they do not understand the moral harm of women not being in the workplace. The problem is not up to the individual woman, because individual women can choose not to be in the workplace. It's in the aggregation that over generations we have had women exit the workplace in the numbers of hundreds of millions that has led to the aggregate loss of income and aggregate loss of economic and political power. The question then is, do our economies of scale solve back for that? Because in our world, where you only require 10 women in a community to now raise children, rather than the 100 in the community that require to do that, we tell you that's better, because now 90 women can go to the workplace, rather than in your world where 100 women can go to the workplace when their children are at state-sanctioned schools. But the majority are worked to the bone, are unlikely to have any upward mobility or promotion, because when they get home, they have to work, they cannot work overtime, and there are multiple inequalities in place. The second piece of analysis here is that likely it is going to be much more asymmetric, because we told you the problem in poorer communities that we wanted to touch upon and prioritize in this debate are ones in which the economic resiliency does not exist. That when there was the building of institutions over multiple generations, those did not withstand recessions. That whenever there was a recession, the daycare closed and the women had to go back to their households. That when there was a recession, the school board fell apart and taxes were insufficient. Yes, we might displace the state in some circumstances, but I would posit the state has failed the poor in the majority of circumstances in this debate. I'll take CO.
So in the best case scenario of your of your arguments, where children develop deep and abiding relationships and feelings for their community, to what extent do you then think it's possible for children who don't feel like they belong to be able to leave when they feel such strong feelings of obligation?
So the first is, I'm going to empirically intuition pump this, I'm sorry. But like Rumspringa exists, people who are Amish still leave. Yes, the majority go back, but that's an autonomous decision. And the way in which they're framed as NCO as something being nefarious is just wrong. And same with OO, that there's jealousy and ill feeling. I think children can learn that in a community setting, the disabled child needs more time, that they can learn and naturalize these opinions to be their own, to feel a commonality with the disabled child they now have to share a classroom, now have to share a household with, and is likely that even if we bind them and utilize them in this way, the privileged children sending remittances back, having to help the disadvantaged individuals in their community that cannot move out, that have to provide materially and share communally because they have built up empathy and political will and friendship towards one another. That's something I'm willing to accept. Fuck their individuality. Individuality is just a misnomer in this debate. This individuality is what has led to the atomization that all government teams agree to in this debate, that children have grown apart from one another, that parents have grown competitive and seeing their child as individuals, not members of a community. The reality is we live in communities and we live in a society that needs to value that and provide the resources for the poorest. We provide those by maybe instrumentalizing some individuals to provide an economy of scale, to pool resources, to create the common public goods that were good. If CO wants to just stand behind one student getting multiple higher test scores, so be it. We're willing to sacrifice that student.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the opposition whip.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Give me a bit. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. It is absolutely shocking to me that Sam decides in that last 30 seconds of his speech to say we don't care about individuality. We would rather everybody be communally bound to a particular identity, because it's those communal identities that bind themselves together and structurally lock out individuals who differ from the norm, who want to be, who for example don't conform to traditional stereotypes of who you should love, or traditional gender stereotypes, who don't conform to the way in which society you see society and the conservative norms that exist within these societies. Those are the people who lose disproportionately, of whom I suggest are many of the people who are the most disprivileged, and these are the people we think are the most important to protect. The first thing I want to do is explain why I think our benefit is particularly critical, and then I'll explain why I think that sweeps the debate. First, what do I think how do I think we defend the idea of individuality? There are 3 things that I think Shermaine tells you that are particularly important. The first thing she tells you is that kids there's the decrease in the extent to which kids have a pressure to conform on our side of the house. The response you hear from Sam is that this happens similarly if you have a conservative parent. I think the difference is just tremendous, right? For 3 reasons. First, the extent to which you have the ability to access alternatives is a lot greater at a point that instead of being locked into your commune, you are more likely to have diverse interactions across communes on our side of the house. Secondly, recognize that on our side, the degree of space is incredibly different as well. If you have just one parent, you're a lot more likely to have the ability to, there's the space to explore because people aren't looking over you all the time. Lovro uses this to say that you will play differently. I think the reality is the way in which you conceptualize the world is entirely different. It's not about fucking playing differently as OO tells you. But the third thing to note is that at the point that you are less communally tied together among both children and adults, there is less degree of groupthink because you don't have the same degree of reinforcement of these conservative norms on a day-to-day basis. And that is when at the point that liberal norms exist or liberal values exist, they are able to blend and move into these communities, which means that there's a significant difference in your ability to conform. But the second distinction that we give you is that future generations are able to move vis-a-vis a world in which every society is communal and therefore insular within that communalism, because that is how you get opening government's benefit of having a greater group of all adults, all of whom you can immediately trust. That insularity means that on that side of the house, their world is one where you don't have alternative support structures, because it's impossible to access and get into those support structures on that side of the house. The implication of that is on that side, you're going to lock people into these communities significantly more. Or say one line about how there's not going to be alternatives. We explain why the alternatives cannot exist on that side. But the third thing that I think we give you here is that to the degree that you have individual children within each family unit, you have the ability to actually negotiate with your parents. Parents are better able to customize this care because the terms of these relationships can be negotiated when it's one child to one parent. Vis-a-vis a world where it's 10 children to 10 parents and you need to conform to a best fit line because you need to take care of all of these children at the same time on that side of the house. It's entirely unclear how they can shift the way in which they parent to help each individual child on a communal level on that side. The implication of this is that I think only we allow the child to get the specific help that we want in society. Recognize that we live in a world where even pedagogically in schools, we attempt to shift towards ways of teaching that conform to help each individual child. I think the problem on that side of the house is that they veer away from this, which means that each child gets less benefit than they otherwise could have. The reason why ultimately we think we beat out OO is twofold. The first is that I think everything on our side assumes the best case scenario of norms being fundamentally different, assumes that you'll care about each individual child as opening government's best case scenario requires. Even then, we suggest that the way in which you go about caring for each individual child is going to hurt them. And that's why I think we're a lot more charitable to the gov world than the opening up. But the second thing to note is fundamentally OO is speculative in terms of each child's relationship being different. We give you the structural reasons for why all children are likely to be stuck in family structures that limit the extent to which they get individualized attention. Vis-a-vis, maybe some child is jealous or more jealous than some other child. I don't know. It depends on the child, right? I'm going to take OG here.
Theo agreed that people shift their values to those of the community raising them. As we already say, that is exactly what causes the ever-growing spiral of open relationships and trust and security. We are the only team to analyze why communities will necessarily grow in this beneficial way in the world where the motion plays out.
Well, that is entirely uncomparative to everything that I've told you about how I think identities are going to shift. So I don't see how that's still relevant in the debate. CG, I'll just take you now.
So the material benefits can't be underplayed because even in poorer communities, when you pool resources together, they are obviously more than each individual family getting the same resource.
Got that, moving there now, right? So given this benefit, let's take this against the gov bench. The claim from closing gov is that it will help the child because by forcing them to coalesce, we therefore create structural change. My first problem here is that I think this structural change also can come elsewhere, right? The status quo is one where minority communities tend to be communities where there are inherent incentive structures for people who leave this community to give back because this is a common grounding that they have. The difference is the degree to which they feel obligated to give back is a lot lower on our side when it compared to their side, and all of them are your parents, and therefore you're that same deep bond, which means that you are more bound. Whereas I think we hit a balance on our side of the house. But the second thing to note is that it's entirely unclear on that side why forcing people to bind together means that you are going to succeed insofar as all of the other structural problems in society that discriminate against minorities still exist. There's not actually the mechanization there, which means that their benefit in itself is fundamentally questionable, right? They claim that the state is not going to be displaced, ignores the fact that the way in which you conceptualize our obligations in society change, but you fundamentally think that your obligation is by the commune rather than by the state, which means that the way in which you can lift this up is a lot more difficult on your side, even if you have this political capital. But look, even if you get this, so what, right? Because they don't explain to you the comparative, even though Sam heard the extension from Sherm about how the ability to get access is weighed relative to the fundamental emotional and psychological harm that exists. The intuition pump you hear in Ricky is insufficient to tell you why all of these emotional issues of being left out are going to be solved on that side of the house. But finally, I suggest that even if there's some benefit, it will benefit kids who already conform, who are most likely to be successful within those communities and the communities on our side anyway, even with comparatively less support structures vis-a-vis on that side where you might get these support structures, but kids suffer disproportionately if they don't conform. The opening government's case is that children don't get emotional security. At best, this again is disproportionately helpful to kids who are already normative and therefore fit into these social norms. These kids are likely to also have friends regardless and alternate means of emotional security. So I don't see why they're the most important. The question is twofold. One, what about kids who don't have this freedom to conform? What happens to them? And I suggest that when you're locked in, that's when you get a disproportionate loss of emotional security on their own metrics, because the adults that they want you to trust are also the adults who are pressurizing you to conform to things that you just structurally cannot conform to or don't want to conform to. But the second question you must ask is, what about the future? What about a point where, like, even if you get some emotional security now, this becomes exploitative against you for years and years and years to come? They never explain why this emotional security in short term should outweigh the problems in the long term that I think will exist. And that is why we think communitarianism to the extreme under this policy is something we cannot support. Thanks.